And I think we've got very clear evidence that boundaries are enormously important to children. Don, just a final comment on that from you, perhaps?
Yeah, I think we've raised a very, very general and very important point here, and I think one of the things that differentiates adolescence in 2009, 2010 from adolescents perhaps of my generation was that we did have rules. We had a greater level of certainty. We had a greater level of place and of who we were and what we might become than adolescents have nowadays. There's more ambiguity, I think, in the lives of adolescents now. And why is this important? Well, firstly, it's not a good vehicle to teach them to adapt if they don't know how, when they behave in one way, there'll be a consequence in another way. But there's a very old psychological rule of thumb, and that is that uncertainty breeds anxiety. And if you don't have the rules, if you don't have the structures, if you live in a world where everything is ambiguous, where the borders are fuzzy, and there's no certainty about whether if you act in this way something's going to happen or not, then in a certain number of adolescents, and I suspect a growing number, that leads to anxiety. And anxiety, as we know clinically, can lead to depression. So I think there's an interesting, if somewhat simplified, causal model there.
But that's not a call for a return to punitive parenting, is it?
Oh, no. It's a call to try and set realistic boundaries and to try and achieve agreement in those boundaries. And that raises, I think, another general issue that we were sort of bordering around, and that's communication. Because if adolescents and their parents particularly, but their teachers and others as well, aren't communicating, then how can you expect the boundaries to be set? How can you expect the rules to be understood? How can you expect the consequences to be known? So communication is clear and absolutely important in this.
And I guess if the relationship has fallen apart, then it's impossible to enforce any kind of boundaries.
Indeed.
Yeah. We have another question up here and then another Twitter question.
Hello. I know that the panel has addressed uncertainty, has addressed adolescents' need for love, has addressed feeling whole and having intimacy, and also industry in their lives. Now, in the light of this, I've noticed that in this country, liberty is a great thing, freedom is a great thing, but I've seen that over the course of the history of the last century and in this decade, that there's been a slide away from spirituality, and that this is becoming more secular society, and with the rise of secular society has created people growing up who have not learned about a spirituality, not learned about having perhaps a certainty in a God. Can any of the panel perhaps comment on perhaps the value of having a God? Is spirituality helpful for adolescent psychology?
I think there's a couple of interesting things to unpack there, and the first that occurs to me in the context of what we've been discussing is that religion was an important structure in many people's lives in the past, and it was a set of common values to which just about everyone adhered, and perhaps that's one of the causes of uncertainty. Have we got a comment? Would someone like to take that on?
I'd like to kind of look at the question of values, and I agree with the question that's coming. There has been a big change, and I think we need to look at how we make things work now, given the change, because we're not going to be able to just make everyone go to church and join a religion. And I guess if we look at what the functions were that religion served and still do for some people, there's a very strong role modelling function, but also this concept of values. And it's certainly a new thing that we're using in therapy now, a therapy that has as a core component a concept of knowing what your values are. And it's a very unusual concept for a lot of people. They don't know what their values are, but yet they used to. But there may have been values before that were imposed externally, and that's not necessarily a problem because it gives you some guidance in that structure that we've talked about, the boundaries and structure to live by. And I think where we can start to pick up the gap between, for those people who don't have that religious influence now, is we can still be talking about the things that does serve for people, and that is giving that structure, giving some values, some ways in which they can guide their decision making and be responsible and accountable for the choices that they're making, because every choice that we make has a consequence. And I think that we've lost sight of what those consequences are.
Although I would observe that often when very young people adhere to religious values very strongly, sometimes that's deeply conservative, sometimes the imposition of values perhaps that you're describing is a factor. I wondered, Jessica, your thoughts on that?
I think one of the things that modern psychology would focus on in focusing on values, and maybe as a result of secularism, is the assumption that to have values is all that's required, not that we actually should question what the content of those values are. And I would actually say that is worth investigation, because really what you're starting to talk about is what will make your life meaningful, where you want it to go, that kind of thing. So I think it's a very important thing. It's not time wasted if you spend time thinking about that.
Larry, you had a comment?
Well, the only point I would make is that, I would agree with the other panelists in that institutional practice, for example, of the kind I think that you may have been alluding to, is not necessarily a guarantee also of aspects of security or certain kinds of values or behaviors. So it's very difficult to tell if you're looking at institutional practices concerning, let's say, religion, which may be a manifestation of certain kinds of values. The practice itself doesn't really tell you all that much. At least this is what many of the studies have shown. So values can be embodied in other ways, and they can be manifested in other ways.
I'm wondering, we'll go to the Twitter question a couple more in just a moment, but I'm actually wondering whether you see things that have replaced that kind of regulating role that religion plays. And it occurs to me that things like environmental activism, that certain political values might be a substitute for the role that religion used to play in people's lives. Charlie, would you like, you're an environmental activist yourself?
Yeah, definitely. I'm constantly amazed at the passion with which young people approach activism today. And I think, I would agree with you that it has replaced, a sort of faith, looking out to the world and trying to get values from somewhere and trying to find a group to work with it that shares the same kind of interest. But I'm just interested to hear about what you're talking about, values as well. And I think that a really important place where values comes is from having good parenting. And I think that in today's world where we often have two parents working full time, they're simply not in the home and they're not communicating with their children, and they don't maybe even know what their children are doing or what their children are thinking. And I think, particularly in childhood, kids are looking to their parents for those values, and that does then inform, the sorts of things that they do in adolescence and the sorts of values that they take into adulthood. So
I think I would challenge the assumption that it's an either-or thing, like that it's activism or religion, because I think actually that often they can be compatible. And I would also challenge the assumption that levels of spirituality and religiosity are decreasing in our young people. Like I think, one example which comes to my mind is World Youth Day last year. That was the biggest gathering of people in Australia ever, and it was young people. So, I think those assumptions are not clear-cut.
Although it was also the lowest number of World Youth Day participants ever, and part of that, although there was distance, part of that was also attributed to the fact that Australian teenagers were not that enthusiastic about going themselves. So we had a lot of people from other cultures who'd retained those strong religions.